started with a tree in the last one, and forgive me for being repetitive, but I kind of want to do the same thing, only now I want to use all the things we went over in the last video. So again, it's not going to be a ton of narration. This is mostly just going to be practice and repetition, so you really get those things down. I will talk a little bit about what I'm doing while I'm doing it, but you can always follow along. I will have my keystrokes captured right here in the corner. Okay, so last video we started with the tree and we added a cylinder for the trunk. So we can do the same exact thing, only now we can do a lot more with this by tabbing into edit mode. So I think what I'm going to start with is moving the pivot point. So I just went into wireframe by holding Z and clicking over to the wireframe. You can also press 4, which is the shortcut right here. And deselecting by clicking off of it, drag and click. I'm going to snap the 3D cursor exactly onto this edge loop because I have that unselected. I'm going to hold Shift and S, cursor to selected. So now it's exactly on there. So if I tab, now if I tab out into object mode, right click, origin to 3D cursor now. Origin's there, and I can press Alt and G. And now the bottom of this tree is exactly at the world origin. But what's more is that now if I scale this up and down, the height changes from the bottom. And so I don't have to do that thing where I was like scaling it and then moving a little bit and then scaling it and then moving it a little bit. This just makes it a lot easier. So we just had these kind of straight cylinders last time. So now back in edit mode, wireframe, make sure that all the back faces are selected by selecting through the mesh. Let's scale the base up. It's probably a little too much. So now it's just like a little bit more of a dynamic shape rather than just those straight trunks. I'm going to right click on it and shade it smooth so we don't get those hard edges that we're going around. I think now we're going to add a UV sphere, move it up. And this part is kind of the same as we did it last time, but actually instead of squashing this, flattening this sort of in this Z direction, what I'm gonna, which we did last time, which was case of this widest point in the middle, I want the widest point to be more down here. So I think the way I'm gonna do that is with proportional editing. So I'm gonna tab into edit mode. And so I'm just trying to think about how I really want to do this. So I think I'm just gonna grab one of these loops that's sort of partway to the bottom by pressing and holding Alt and then clicking in between just to select those. I'm gonna turn on proportional editing by clicking this icon. And then I'm gonna just move this loop by going G and then Z and using my mouse scroll wheel to adjust the influence. Same thing. Hit O to turn it off just so we don't get this weird peak. We can turn off the proportional editing. G, V. Just to flatten out that top a little. I like this more already, but we're going to use the same techniques we used last time now to kind of build this out more. So now that we have this kind of more squashed form, if we duplicate this one, we can start pulling these layers out, you know, and adjusting the size. And now that we know how to edit these meshes on individual scale, we don't have to leave them as all the same as each other, you know, just scaled down. So like we had this general shape, but if we go into this one by selecting it and pressing tab, we can get more varied shapes for each of these branches. And then we don't even have to keep them this smooth. We can select an edge loop, for example, by holding Alt and clicking between them. And then with proportional editing on, if we scale, adjust our radius a little, we can get sort of these interesting curves. Plus, we don't even have to leave these as these perfect circles. We can come into this object and grab a portion here. You can select this one and then hold Control and click to select the shortest path, which will select all these edges, but not all the way into the center. We can grab them and sort of create these divots just so the shape's a little bit less uniform. So we have this more sort of amorphous blob type, so that when we set that into our tree. So we could either go for this really smooth, really clean, sort of cartoony look, or something with just a little bit more detail in it. So let's duplicate this one. We can still transform these on an object level. So now we have a less uniform shape. So if we scale it along the X, should scale it on the local X by double tapping X, we can really get a lot of variation out of these just by duplicating them. Scaling them in different ways. Duplicating, and then maybe coming into edit mode and just kind of randomizing these by just sort of grabbing, not really moving it along a particular axis, just trying to give it sort of a randomized shape. And you can spend a long time trying to get these shapes perfectly fine too, which we're not going to do. We're going to keep this pretty loose, but you get the idea. Well, it's a bit of trial and error, but you can see that all I'm doing is moving these at an object level, scaling them, rotating them, placing them, and then coming in and at the edit level on some of these and doing the exact same thing. And it's just a little trial and error until you get something that looks all right, at least from a distance, right? Add some more branches to it. Oops, what? Pressing the wrong keys. So this is how we did the branches before, where you just duplicated the trunk and scaled them down, but now we can have them tapered a bit, doing the same thing. We don't have to have them exactly the same as the trunk. You can go here and scale it a little bit in orthographic view. Let's Control 7 for the bottom view again. With double tapping Z after pressing S to scale it locally along the Z rotation of this cylinder, which would be along this direction. I just want to make sure the trunk is coming up into this mesh, so this one doesn't look so much like it's floating. So to do that, I'm just going to select the trunk. And this is kind of the nice thing about keeping these objects separate to begin with and just merging them at the end, is that when I tab into edit mode, I'm not seeing any of these vertices that are in front of it and these other objects. So when I box select, it is only selecting those. I still have proportional editing on, turn that off. So just now when you look at it, you can see the trunk part there, and it just looks a little bit more solid. So again, not maybe a masterpiece, but you know, sort of a cartoony, stylistic look. Looks pretty good. So now I want to join these all together. So I'm just gonna, since I don't have anything else in my scene right now, I can just select it by pressing A. And then I just want to make sure that the trunk is the active by shift clicking it, because I want to maintain this pivot point that I so carefully set up earlier. So pressing Control and J to join. And now you'll see that it rotates around that point. So when I move it around, it's just easier to keep it on the ground when the pivot is at the bottom. Okay, so we're not necessarily going to recreate the last scene that we made entirely. The tree is kind of maybe like a good sort of barometer for how we're doing, because already we've improved and we've added a lot of detail from our last tree. I'm just going to Shift D and duplicate these from the top. Just add a little more things to it. So in the previous video, we were making rocks, and all I could really do was flatten them, which isn't very, it gives a rough rock-like appearance, but it's very circular, it's very uniform, which doesn't really look very rock-like. I was going to say realistic, but these aren't necessarily realistic either. This is more of a stylized, but they still need to look like the things that we're trying to represent. Again, I have proportional editing on right now, which is why I can quickly squish this form up so it looks a little bit flatter on the bottom side. There's sort of a hole in the bottom, but if it's on the bottom, it shouldn't matter. We'll fix it anyway in case we want to rotate this around. And of course, we've already forgotten to start naming these. Real quick. Control C to copy it, press enter, click on these, F2, Control V. Work. Going back into some of these duplicates because they're all the exact same shape right now, and now that we know how to edit these meshes individually, there's no reason why our rocks all should be identical. They can be similar, just maybe not identical. So, I know we're starting sort of in a similar way as our last demo, but the result I don't think is going to be the same. I box selected here and I didn't want the ground, so all I did was I held shift and I clicked on it to deselect it. So even though I don't have an active object anymore, because all these are highlighted in blue, not green, blue is the selection, remember, I can still move these around. That move operation does not require any particular object to be active. So we're gonna hit G and then Shift C to slide it back along the ground, just to give us like, I don't know, more of a clearing in the middle here. Maybe we'll do some sort of building or structure or something. Trees are great, but they're not that interesting, unfortunately. We see a lot of trees. We don't really pay attention to them. So usually they like make good set dressing, but not necessarily want to be your focal point. Yeah, so we can edit these. We can do some better, well, maybe not better. We can do some different style buildings, not just those city blocks and things. So what I just did there was I moved this cube up to sit on this ground plane, but I did it in edit mode so that the origin would be at the bottom. That's just generally good practice for anything that needs to sit on a surface. It's best to have the origin of it at the bottom, unless you have a reason not to. Okay, so now that we can edit cubes like this, we can make things like pitched roofs, which I was not able to do with just the object level transform. So let's just duplicate this and set it as close as we can right on top of our other one. So now we're going to tab into edit mode. And we're going to scroll out a little. So this is actually going to be the front, because that aligns it with the world view, so that if I have this selected and I press 1, we're looking at the front, which matches here what it says. And it's just easier. We can always rotate the entire thing after we've built it if we wanted it to rotate another way. So just select the top face and press S and X, and actually we do not want proportional editing on for this one. Not that there's really enough vertices on a cube for that to matter, but turn it off. Okay, S, X, bring it real close together. Close as you like, I guess. Cool. I'm just going to wireframe mode so that I can select this bottom face, which is normally obstructed, and scale it out a little bit to give it more of like eaves on the roof, you know? And then these have actually scaled in on the Y, which I did not want, but I can fix it. I can just go into select both of these edges onto top view by pressing 7 on the numpad, S, Y, and just line it back up. Okay, that's better. No house is complete without a chimney, at least not in the cartoons, so I'm gonna give it a little chimney. I also don't want this to overhang, and this happened for the same reason that these edges weren't scaled appropriately, is that I forgot to lock the access. So what you have to do to fix it is select this face, shift select this face, S, and I think it's Y axis, yes it is. Just bring it in. And then if you wanted to line it up more exactly, you could go into right or left orthographic, S, Y, and then just make sure it's lined up as close as you can get it. Again, moving this in edit mode so that the pivot goes to the bottom, and scaling it down so the height matches here. I'm just going to add sort of like a extension, just so this house isn't just a perfect, you know, square. It's just not very realistic. Again, not that this scene is dripping with realism or anything. So now, because we can use edit mode, once I have this placed, if I wanted to make this longer, in the previous video, we would have to go S and then X and scale it and then move it manually. And that's kind of a lot of operations. And it also messes up, you know, this nice placement I just did. So instead, what I'm going to do is tab into edit mode, make sure face selection is enabled, select this face, press G and then X to just move this face out, which is going to stretch these ones. Now it will leave the pivot where it is, so it's no longer going to be centered. That's just something to be aware of, but it is a way that we can move things around with finer control. Okay. Let's make another roof. Same way. Kind of like these high-pitched gables. It's kind of cool looking. Actually, let's, instead of matching that, just because I really like that angle, it's kind of funky, we can select these top edges with the box and try to match this to that. Again, just using the transform tools. Nothing fancy. We want to join these two together, at least make them appear as if they're joined together. Same thing, grab X and just move it until it intersects, so it creates this nice line here. And yes, the inside is, you know, messy, but we're not going to see the inside of these objects. I feel like a house like this needs like a porch. Oh, that is one thing that I forgot to mention. If you are in edit mode on a particular object, you press Shift A and you add another object to it, these objects are not connected physically by edges or faces, but they are now part of the same object. So if I tab out, you can see that when I select one, it selects both because this is now one object. So to delete something like this, all you have to do is select the part that you didn't mean to add, press X, and delete all the vertices. And that will get you back to just this. We're going to go more over stuff like that in future lectures, but if it comes up while you're modeling that you accidentally add an object while you're in edit mode, you just want to delete the vertices to get rid of it. I'm just going to have this as sort of a foundation under the whole thing. No, actually I changed my mind. I'm going to do it this way. It is still going to be sort of cutting into this portion, but that's okay. Like I said, we won't ever see the inside. Just trying to think about scale a little bit in this one. This one is not built to scale. These trees are 2.54 meters tall, so a little bit taller than a door. So this is sort of a miniature. Now I could scale, I could select everything and scale it back up so it's world size, but I don't really need it to be world size for any reason. So I'm just trying to eyeball the scale. So it's like a tree is this, and you know, a very highly pitched building is this, and we might need to make some adjustments with this as we go on, because when you're eyeballing scale, sometimes you just have to work it back and forth a little to get it right. But once we get what looks to be a reasonably sized door in, that can help a lot with measuring things by eye. So this would be like a one-story building, but like these roofs are just like comically pitched high, but I kind of like them. We might change it in a bit, but let's just keep going with this as be a scooch bigger. This is our door. So with that snapping menu, another thing we can do with this cursor is move it more precisely when we want to add new objects. So I'm gonna select this door. Again, if you're having trouble visualizing some of this stuff, this has to do with the shading modes we went over. Don't worry about any of this right now, but just click cavity and we'll draw these edges a little bit more clearly. So with this door selected, we can do the same thing we did as when we were moving the pivot. We can hold Shift and S and pick cursor to selected, and it's going to snap this cursor directly onto the origin of this object. So this isn't exactly where I need it, but it's a lot closer than it was sort of in the middle of this building. So from here, I can add a cylinder and start building up the doorknob that way. So I just did scale and then held Shift and double pressed Z to lock the local Z scale of this, so it gets thinner but not shorter. And then just double tap Z to get the local Z. You could also, because this is exactly in the origin, if I pressed Y, it would have the same effect, but you've rotated this cylinder 90 degrees, and unless you change that, the saved rotation of this, unless you rotate it in unless you rotate it in edit mode, if you rotate it in object mode, it's always going to remember that these flat faces are up in the local direction. Okay. The other interesting thing we can do now is we've already gone over how to shade something smooth versus shade it flat. But now that we are more familiar with edit mode, we can do this on a per face basis. So when I shade this whole thing smooth, it also smooths out these faces, but I want to keep those flat. So if we select this cylinder, tab into edit mode, and then select this loop of faces by holding Alt and clicking on the edge between them, now it's selected everything but these end caps. So now if we right click to pull up that, oh, it's not here actually. It's in this face menu. So these menus will give you some operations, and we'll get more into these later, but since we already know how to shade things smooth and flat, I don't feel like this is jumping too far ahead. Just hit face, go down to shade smooth. So now we have that these edges are smoothed while this one remains flat. It's just really handy for getting things to look the way they're supposed to look. So again, I'm going to snap my cursor by selecting this cylinder, holding Shift S and pressing cursor to selected. Again, not exactly where I want to add a new object, but it's closer than it was. Shift A, UV sphere. We'll see that because it added a sphere that is so much larger than our little mini scene here, our camera ended up inside of it. No worries, just zoom out and scale it back down. I'm going into wireframe to get these back faces that are obscured. Select just that one. I'm going to turn on proportional editing, G, Y, and scroll all the way down so I can get sort of a flat. Actually, I want to do that on the other side. That's more doorknob shaped. Kind of flatten it on this side. face mode, Alt, select, and we'll select just these ones around. Scale, Shift, Y, just to make it a little bit thinner. We're gonna just eyeball it. Cool. That's maybe too high. That's pretty decent. So now I'm going to, with these selected, select the door, Control to join, but because I didn't move the pivot already, we talked about in the lecture, it doesn't open like a door, so no worries, we know how to do this. Select this edge where you want the hinges to be, Shift S, cursor to selected, Tab to go back into object mode, right click, set origin, origin to 3D cursor. So now dot is down here, rotating it around the Z as it rotate properly. I mean, we're not going to be animating this, so it doesn't fully matter if you do that, but I don't know, for things like doors, you just want them to move. If you move them around a lot when you're, you know, sort of working out how you want your scene to look, sometimes it's just easier if they move the way you expect things to move. I just shift right click just to move our cursor onto the surface. And added a cube. Just doing some windows now, like we did last time, except we're doing it this different sort of building, so ours are going to be a little bit more square. And everything I'm doing now is stuff we did in the last demo, so I'm not really explaining it because you've seen it all before, but it's still important to get repetition and practice because it's the only way you're going to memorize how to do these functions and these hotkeys and things like that. Turn off proportional editing. So what I just did there is, instead of trying to like guess by scaling the whole object and moving and scaling and moving where this lines up, what I did instead was I just lined it up on one side, and then I tabbed into edit mode and grabbed just this, I guess I grabbed just this edge. That's okay, because I can show you how to fix this. So if you accidentally grab just an edge and now like you want this to be flat, because if you look at it from the top down, it should be straight, and it's not, because I wasn't in wireframe when I grabbed it, so it didn't grab this back edge. It only grabbed this one when I moved it. So to get this to be flat again, it's really easy. We're just going to set the scale of this single face to 0 along the axis that it needs to be flat on. So this direction is the x-axis. So all I have to do is select this face and only this face, press S, X, and 0, and it will flatten that up. Same works if it's in the Y or the Z. S, Y, 0, S, Z, 0 will flatten it along that axis. But as I was saying, what I did was I aligned this edge first. You can even get a little bit finer. So you just align this edge, scroll, and I'm shift and middle mouse clicking and dragging, of course, to pan. And then we can, and I mean, as far as how far you want to zoom in and how exact it needs to be, that's up to you. You know, it depends what distance you're going to be viewing it at, you know, what is the target for this. So if it's something that's like you were 3D printing like a tiny model of this, you're never going to notice. But, you know, if it's going to be a huge, like, say like a first person game environment, so your camera would be like here, you might notice. So just keep in mind, what is this for really, and how exact does that need to be? Because you can spend hours and hours and hours trying to get it perfect and still not really get it right. Shift D, and then instead of moving it, I'm just going to right click to drop it. The duplication is still there and it is selected, so I'm going to hit R and then X and then 90. Oops, I meant R and then Y and then 90. Sorry. I forgot which way I was facing. And then again, the Z fighting, we saw this in the last demo. Fix it, just offset it ever so slightly. Looks pretty good. We're going to select all these frame bits and select the window, like the part that would be glass last. G, and now we have with it our pivot right in the center. Okay. Duplicate these windows a little bit. Just realized there weren't really eaves coming out that way from this additional piece, so I scaled it a little bit. We'll fix it back a bit. Just thinking about what I want to do next. We're going to do some like columns and bring out like a sort of an overhang here. And just in right orthographic by pressing 3. Lining up the bottom of this. And while it's probably best practice to put the pivot down here at the bottom, I don't really think it's necessary for this, because I'm probably going to join this all to be one object. So it won't really matter where the individual pivots were. It just matters where the object you join it to, where that one's pivot is. Avoid tangent lines with these objects so it looks good even when viewed in orthographic mode. I'm going to make some steps up to this porch just by scaling and duplicating some of these cube objects. And just kind of moving them until they look approximately even. There's a gap here, so instead of scaling this because it's going to mess up this distance, what I'm going to do is go into 3 for right orthographic, which flipped me completely around because I was looking at the left side, but it's okay. Holding Z, going to wireframe, dragging, and just selecting this face. Remember, I'm in face selection mode. Now I can press G and Y and just move it back. And if you're like to be really exact, you can move all of these to be roughly the same. So they, I don't know. You don't have to do this. This is extra credit, I guess. So they're about like that. We'll get some Z fighting, but we can fix that. Let's go into 3. Oops, 3. It's just because this shape is coming in and intersecting here. So we can, the same principle, we can tab into edit mode and then hit Z in wireframe. And then box select. Just make sure you don't box select over this dot. This dot just is telling you how this face is selected. Like if I drag over here, it doesn't get selected, but if I drag over the dot, it does. So there is a dot. It's very hard to see on this face because we're looking at it exactly flat. So just drag over the center. The dot, it's always going to be in the center. Drag over that. G, Z, And then as close as you can reasonably get it to this line here. Tab back into object mode, select, tab into edit mode, drag over the center part. And then this would be like the ground level. I think this actually is our ground plane. Yeah, it is. So we can have it resting exactly or close to exactly by doing that. So now you come out, no more flickering, no more Z-fighting. You can still see this sort of line where they're stacked on top of each other, but it's at least not, it's not doing that awful flickering thing that it was doing. So I think I just want to drag this over this. I don't know. I don't think I want to create like another gable. Let's see how this looks. Again, I'm not an architect, so as far as like how roofs are designed and things like that, that's not really my area of expertise. So forgive me if this doesn't come out looking completely architecturally accurate. It's kind of wonky, isn't it? I guess you would move the whole thing over, not just that. So I want to move these at the same rate. So I'm going to do that by in wireframe and in front orthographic, box selecting so it selects everything behind it. Again, snapping back into front, and then box selecting these, and then leaving this one unselected. GX, just shift it over. Didn't do exactly what I wanted. I probably should have had proportional editing on, but it's okay. We can just eyeball it. Again, this is not for like architectural, you know, CAD. This is just for like an art scene, so it doesn't have to be, you know, perfect. Going into vertex select mode so I can pick up an individual point, turn on proportional editing, and just press G to give this scroll to increase, give this sort of a blob shape. We're going to make another shrub here just because I feel like there would be, you know, stuff planted here if this were a person's house. All I'm doing is shift duplicating and manipulating this at the object level with our move, scale, and rotate tools, just like we did last time. And then we can tab into edit mode on some of these individual pieces and try to reshape them sort of as best we can. There's only so much we can do at this level of detail. Like I said, we don't yet know how to add more points onto this mesh to give us, you know, more detail and more control, but that's going to be the next video. Well, do look more like rocks. So let's try this another way. Let's try this with like a more grassy look, spiky look. So we're gonna add, I guess cones would be the best way to do that at this stage. Just hitting Z in wireframes so when I'm underneath it, I can still see what I'm doing. Tab, edit mode, and selecting this bottom face and scaling it in to give it a more narrow look to it. And shading it smooth. And giving it some. So that was just this, that was just going into wireframe again to get this bottom face selected. Like Shift S, cursor to selected. Now if I tab back in object mode and go to set origin, origin to 3D cursor. Now the origin is down on this face, so when I rotate it, it rotates like this. And the reason I wanted that is so when I duplicate it, I can like, if I shift D around the, so what I just did, that was kind of fast. Let me go undo that. So I selected one, I pressed Shift D, and then instead of moving it, you can right click to drop it. You can hit R, Z, and it'll rotate around the Z exactly from that point that it was duplicated at. Now when I Shift D and I scale it right away instead of moving it, it scales from that point, so I can make like shorter little blades of this thing pretty easily. Shift D, R, move it, Z, or S, sorry, not Z. Shift D, R, S. Kind of funny looking, but you know, doesn't look any worse than an N64 game. Something like that. Okay, so this is like a shrub. Maybe it's like a cactus. We'll say it's a cactus. Just shift clicking on all of these. And since all these points are relatively in the middle, I'm not sure that it matters totally which one is active, since all these points are relatively close to each other. So for our purposes, at this level of accuracy, we're just going to Control J. Now, if we keep these small enough, I think they will still, you know, read to the eye at a certain distance as plants. Let's say that, you know, whoever lives here had planted these in a row, right? As you might do. Yeah, because at this distance, your brain looks at that and says, plants. Even though at this distance, you're kind of like, oof. If it wasn't clear, the reason why I go into top view a lot when I'm laying things out is because I can just press Shift D or G to, you know, duplicate or to move something. And when I do it, I don't have to select an axis because I'm viewing this exactly from the top. It will not move it up or down towards the camera. So it's just another way of efficiently moving these things around without worrying about them getting shifted up and down the Z axis. Same with the rotate. I can just press R. I don't have to press Z, but it will still rotate around the Z axis. That's true for the other orthographic modes too. Whatever axis your camera is like looking down along, it will lock that axis transformation. So you see, none of them have sunk down any farther than they already were, or come up. I want like some little rocks here now, so I'm just going to duplicate one of the rocks we already have, scale it way down, rotate it, and then same thing that I did with the plants, I just kind of duplicated them out in a line first, and then I can go back and select these and scale them, rotate them to give them a more varied appearance without having to actually change the models, although we probably should be changing some of these models because we're supposed to be practicing our mesh editing skills. So let's do that. Let's edit some of these to give them a more varied appearance. But as you can see, it's much easier to start from sort of your basic shape that you already had for that first rock and go in and edit them than it is to model these all from primitive objects. Let's pop into vertex just to get some of these pointy bits slightly less weird looking. Can select a selection of these and then shift, double click to deselect the ground plane, shift D, and then since I'm in the top orthographic view, it's not going to move these along the Z axis. So I can just shift D and place them freely on the ground. Doing some sort of like gutters or trim or something along this roof line where it meets the main wall because it looks just not right, really. And shift D in the top orthographic, keep it on the same height. So normally this face would be like inset, right? So we can sort of mimic that using the tools that we have learned by duplicating this sort of gutter block thing. Rotate it to, and then we can go into wireframe so that we can see that the angle of this is correct, or as close to correct as we can get it, which it looks like it is. So now from here, I want to like angle these ends. So I'm going to tab into edit mode. I'm going to box select over this, and this will select this whole bottom face. Remember, because these vertices are directly behind the other ones. when you're looking at them from the front. So box select, and then like I showed you before, to get something flat to the world axis, all you have to do is press S for scale, and then in this case we're going to scale it along the Z. So we're going to do Z, and then we're going to hit the number 0, and that will make this face perfectly flat in the Z direction. So I'll make it align with the world. Now we're just going to pick it up and move it with a G, line it up here, and go back into wireframe by holding Z and going to wireframe. Doing the same thing, box selecting, scale, Z, 0. And now we can line this up perfectly with this. So now we have this sort of, you know, protrusion that comes out that just gives this a little bit more depth. And then if you'll remember, we went over this very briefly in the last one. If we Shift D along the X, duplicate this out, place the origin roughly where it needs to be. With the selected, hit S, X, minus 1. Sorry, I mean S, Y. Huh. Not sure. Seems to be confused. It should be mirroring this, and I think it's not mirroring it because of the way that I moved this when it was in object in edit mode. But no worries, we can just rotate it manually. It's no big deal. Sometimes you think you know exactly what Blender is going to do, and it completely does something different. Not often, and it's usually user error. Okay, in this case, it was definitely user error. I wasn't thinking about my object rotations when I was moving it, so I didn't plan properly for it. No biggie, we'll just do it by hand. Just multi-selected and hit Shift D and Y. Selected everything, moved it across. And again, you can go in and fix this Z fighting if you need to. But I think we're going to view it, you know, as holistically from about here. Just thinking about what kind of things I want to add to make this more interesting to look at. I do think it needs like a window up here. And I'm just trying to debate how I want to do it, but I think we're just going to have to do some trial and error. So you'll see now when I tab into edit mode on these joined objects that all of the vertices are here, but that will not stop us from editing it the same way we edit any mesh primitive. So you can just Shift select. With both of these selected, scaling it in on the X will make this shorter. I'm just trying to make this sort of triangular to match this shape. So I should probably look at it from the front. And if I'm looking at this slope, I want it to be roughly, this line to be roughly parallel with this line. It does not have to be exact, but I do want it to be approximately parallel. So what I just did here is I selected this entire object, and when you have multiple separate pieces, as part of a single object, you can select an individual piece by making a single selection on it. In this case, I selected this face, and then while hovering over it, press L on the keyboard, which will select linked. And without messing with any of these settings, all it's going to do is select this whole separate piece and not these pieces that are not attached to it. I'm just scaling this way up just to check the slope. That's about right. So again, making a selection of a single face on this and pressing L. Let's like scale it to about the size we want it. You can do the same thing by selecting one of these little rectangles. L, scale it along the X to drag it out to roughly there. L, G to grab it, and S to scale it along the X. And we're going to make sure this line and this line are roughly parallel. And in this one, instead of scaling it, what we're going to do is select this face, and we're going to bring it down by pressing G to grab it. We're going to rotate it so it's roughly flat. And then we're going to grab this face, grab X, and just line it up that way. Rotate it so it's almost flat. Now for this one, this looks a little strange to have this sort of angle cut up like this when you look at it. So we're going to rotate this face to match this angle. So in front orthographic, you can just press R. You don't have to lock the axis. And then it's still a little bit off, so we're just going to keep doing it. And again, it does not have to be exact for our purposes. So when we zoom out, and it will be more clear that it's correct once this one angle is done too. But you can kind of see if you look at it just like that. It looks good. Same thing, select a face on this one, press L to select linked, grab, and then because these dots always appear in the center of the face, if you line them up, when you rotate it, it should rotate in such a way that it's easier for you to get this angle right. R for rotating. Highlight that one. GX to grab, pull it out. Highlight this one. Grab. Drop. Rotate. Get it roughly there. Rotate this one. And see, I kind of overcompensated to that, so I'll just rotate it back until it lines up. And I don't believe that this one, L to select linked, is exactly in the center. And that I can tell, one, by looking at it, but two, because this dot here is not lined up with this dot here. It's G and X. And now it's in the center. Well, it's closer to the center, as you can see when you zoom out. Let's see, going on here. Oh, all we have going on here is that the part that's like our glass is in front of the panes we just made. So all we have to do is select it and move it back along the Y. And we can even scale it in along the Y a little bit. So now we have our sort of funky triangular-ish window. 3. And then I have these parts protruding, so normally if I was in solid view, I wouldn't be able to line this up with this wall by eye. But if you hit 3 and then you go into wireframe, this will be selected and you can see this line is our wall line, so we can line it up by pressing G and Y and putting it where we need it to be. You might have some other details and accents on this building. So same thing, I want these to match this slope. So I'm going to go to wireframe. So I select this whole face, not just the side that's facing me. I rotate it, grab it in X, rotate it, and same thing on the other side. So now it's nice and flush with that angle there. And move my cursor, Shift S, cursor is selected, and I'll put that right there, which is pretty much in the center of this peak. I'm roughly scaling it to the width I want it, and I want it to be the same width as this piece. So when it adds it as a cube, so all the sides are equal. So if I just scale it uniformly down, I know that this length is the same as this length because that's the nature of a cube. So, oops, I need to hide that. I have to pull it forward so you can see it a little better. So now when I scale it along the Z, it's the same width this way as it is this way. And for this one, the pivot doesn't matter as much to me because I know I won't be moving it a whole ton. So I just got it, I scaled it until the bottom met this, this face of this cube. And now from here, all I can do is I can tab into edit mode, press this face and grab it. And that way I can elongate this without having to scale it down past where I want it to be at the bottom. You'll see it's not totally in the center because our roof probably isn't totally centered, but we can just nudge it over. Nudge this window over. And then maybe pull this back behind the window. Just pull this forward. So it's coming into like the glass part. So I want to bring the glass part of this window more forward. So I'm gonna select just the window, tab, select this face, press L to select everything linked to it, press G to grab it, press Y for the axis, and pull it forward. So now, because this glass is not really glass and it's not really clear, we can have this thing just extend behind it and it still looks okay. Shift D, Z, X. And then because I'm scaling this at an object level, you'll notice that this slope, this angle gets kind of messed up because it's scaling everything in. So like it's the same principle as if we were grabbing this and hitting SX0 to flatten it. You're scaling it to a scale of 0, which is flat. So when you scale things like that at the object level, these, if it's rotated, if it's not flat, it's going to become sort of distorted. So the way to avoid this, if you wanted to keep this exactly the same, let's Control Z to undo. So I've just duplicated it and moved it. So instead of scaling this along the X, I'm going to hit Tab to go into edit mode. I'm going to grab them. I'm going to click and drag to get this face. And from front orthographic, I'm going to press G and then X. Oops, not Z, G and then X. And just slide it until it's there. And that won't affect this side at all. So you can see we've maintained that exact same angle. Just cutting in a little bit over here, we can fix that, no problem. wireframe, grab it, and it's even not exactly at the right rotation. And again, you can zoom in and in and in and get it more and more exact, but it's kind of a diminishing returns thing after some point. We can also duplicate these faces inside the object at the edit level. So I wanted to add sort of a top bar across here. I could do that really easily, but it is going to be part of this roof object. So it's just something to keep in mind, but we can do it. What you have to do is select the face. And this also works with vertices, with vertices and edges. Same thing, you just make your selection, you hit Shift-D. If you want it to be in the exact same place, instead of left clicking, you just right click to drop it. And now I'm just going to press S and Y to scale it out a little bit so it matches this edge right here. Except that, I'm sorry, I have duplicated just that face. And I really wanted was this whole thing. So forget that. We're just going to add the bar manually. I forgot that we have not covered extrusion tools yet. We'll go over that in a future video. Okay, so let's keep going forward with this. Maybe let's put, sounds pretty good. I'll make this fence a little bit more detailed. Last time we just had sort of a block to represent a whole section of fence, but we're going to add a little bit more detail now that we have some access to some mesh editing tools. So in edit mode for this object I've just added in wireframe, roughly, so it's like a privacy fence, you can put it roughly here. We can always adjust it later if it's too tall. Sure. Okay, so just talking about duplicating individual faces and things. So we can do that, but then we're left with just this kind of floating face. But if we have everything selected, for in edit mode and press A, it will select everything within that object. If we hit Shift and D, X, we can duplicate within the object. So it's the same thing. I should say it's the same result as Shift-D, duplicating, and then joining these objects will give you the exact same result, but there's just more than one way to do it. Let's do one more of these by selecting one face, hitting L, only select this and what is linked to it, what is attached to it, Shift-D, X, scooch it over. Okay, so now we have 5 panels. Looks pretty good. But I do want to add a crossbar on the inside of it. So to attach these panels together, you would have to do a crossbar. So I can come in here and select an individual one of these, an individual face of any of these, really. Press L to select everything that's attached to it. Press Shift-D and then Y to bring it inside a little bit. I'm going to press R, Y, and 90 to flip it 90 degrees so it's going horizontally. G, Z. And scale it a little bit in the Z so it's a little bit thinner. But this is just easier than starting with the primitive cube. It's closer to the shape we need. And we did it within edit mode, so we don't have to join anything. We can just tab back into object mode. And this is all now a single object. So if we duplicate this across the X and just start stacking them, we can make a whole fence around this whole thing. It's okay if they sort of intersect with each other a little bit. It won't be noticeable. Now I have like 3 of these in the rotation that I want. I can just select all 3, Shift D, and all on the Y, and do it even faster. Kind of the best part about computer graphics and digital art over traditional is, like, as far as once you model something, you can just replicate it in a second, which you can't necessarily do with traditional art. You know, you'd have to redraw or resculpt these pieces individually. So we can select all of these, this whole side, and then we've also selected the ground. So just Shift, click to make it active, click again to deselect it. So just with all of these selected, we can Shift D, place them roughly so. I suppose they're actually going to rotate around that other one. So the origin of the active object, or rather the middle of the active object, is roughly where you want it. R, 90, flip it 90 degrees, G, Shift Z, and you can place it where you need it along the ground. You can see that, I mean, it took me the longest to model this individual piece, but once I had it, the matter of duplicating it around became very, very quick. You just hit RZ and 180 to flip it exactly 180 degrees, which is facing the opposite way. And then just lining it up close as you need it to be. And I just duplicated these because I want these to move in a straight line and not be shifted in the Y at all. So I just duplicated these across the X-axis. Oops, accidentally grabbed the ground plane there. Just undo that, press Ctrl Z. I'm just checking to see if I didn't accidentally make an extra duplicate. It did not. These don't line up exactly because I wasn't very exact about measuring them when I made it. I was kind of just doing it by eye. It's okay. There's lots of things you can do to make up for this. You know, you could put actual fence posts in between them, and these probably should have them. But like I said, it really depends on what it's for. You know, if this is just going to be way off in the background, you know, and your characters are going to be standing in front, you know, over here, and it's for a film or something, so the camera angle is fixed, you won't need to worry about things like that too much. But we try to be as nice as we can about lining things up. And you can kind of cheat the parts that don't line up correctly. You know, cheat them to the back behind, you know, one of these trees or something. We can even move one of these trees just to cover it. You know, put that right in front. And, you know, unless you're looking at it from over here, which, you know, you're probably not going to. Just rearranging some of the things in this yard just for compositional reasons. You can even have some of these in the backyard, maybe like growing in little clusters around the rocks. So Shift D in orthographic view, we'll just duplicate it and not move it out all along the Z axis. And obviously you can take as much time as you want with something like this. Put as much detail in it as you like. You can even put some of these plants back here to cover some of this fence overlap. Put some more rocks in the yard. You can make one of these like a gate that's open. This is where you'd want to move the pivot point so it can turn correctly. So for this object, I'd probably put the pivot point here because it's the farthest over in this direction. So if I wanted it to pivot from this side, I would select this face, hit cursor to selected, tab out into edit mode, right click, and then origin to 3D cursor. So press Shift C just to reset your cursor so it's not in the way. So now when this one is selected, you can rotate it more like a gate if you wanted it to be a gate. And then we haven't really changed the scale of these in single axis, so they all kind of look very similar. You can come in here and just add some more variation between these. And of course, you can always tab into edit mode, and you'll see all these objects are now part of a single thing, and you can give it even more variation. So a thing to note about proportional editing is if you have an object like this that has multiple separate pieces, you'll notice that when you select a piece, you know, a face or make any sort of selection and you move it with proportional editing on, it moves everything around it, whether or not it's connected. And you may want this, but you also may not. It really depends what you're doing. So in this case, if I didn't want to affect these other branch blobs, what I would do is come to this drop down arrow next to proportional editing. It's like connected only. So now when I select this face and press G, it's only going to move with proportional editing if it's actually physically linked to this face. So it won't affect these separate pieces, even though they're all part of the same object. You can just maybe tweak some of these just so they're a little bit different looking. Shift right click again to move the 3D cursor. Starting from a new icosphere here, because I want this shape that I'm about to make to be more round than these ones that I've manipulated a lot. But I don't want it to be totally round, making like stepping stones. So in edit mode, let's go into vertex select. And now, I mean, we could do this with proportional editing off. You know, it would be a lot harsher, but you would have more control, but it might take you longer. So with things that are sort of more organic, I like to use proportional editing a lot. Because then you can just get these really slight, you know, subtle changes to it. The way that you can definitely get without it, but it just takes longer. Oops, accidentally pressed hide. Just Alt-H to unhide if you accidentally hit H at any point. And again, working in top-down view so I can quickly place these without a bunch of extra keystrokes. Just working at the object level to block these out and get the rough position and scale of them. And then I'm going to go in and make these a little bit more detailed and like conforming to the curves of the ones next to it. So you'll see with these like sort of flagstones, they'll kind of place them in such a way where they'll like fill in the gaps. At least it looks nice when you draw them that way. Just tabbing quickly in and out of edit mode, making really quick edits using G, the grab tool, proportional editing. Not spending too much time on any one of these. Maybe adding a couple little ones in just to break up the sort of size of it. Oh, you see I've accidentally duplicated my ground here. So just delete the extra one. I feel like these sort of get bigger as they go out, and I actually think I want the opposite of that. I'm just going to shift, select all of these, rotate them around the z-axis by 180 degrees, and then move them. I think that looks a little bit better. It's just an aesthetic thing. And then maybe make this like not quite so straight by having some pieces that kind of jut out the sides a little. And maybe shifting some of these over so it's a little more rustic looking. And I've accidentally moved this all up. Again, no biggie. You don't have to work with the plane underneath it. You can always get rid of it if you can sort of visualize in your mind where these cuts are going to be made. So like some of these objects are sunk below the ground line. If you can visualize that for yourself, you don't need the plane if it's getting in your way. But I just think that this gives you a better idea of how the final thing's going to look. Scale Shift Z to make this more of a column. And then I have not moved this in the Z direction at all. So right now, the origin is at a Z value of 0. If I just want to keep the origin at 0, but I want to move this up, the way I like to do it a lot is, I'll go over that more slowly. I have this selected. I hit 1 to go into front orthographic view, just to view it from the front. I press Tab to go into edit mode for this object, and I hold Z and go wireframe to get into the wireframe so that I can select through it. So I drag select to select the bottom face, G, Z, and press it up to the origin. And now if I tab back into object mode, the origin's at the bottom, which is just handy because now I can say, all right, well, I want this to be like a mailbox post. So it's way too big, obviously. So we're just going to scale it way down, and it scales down on that point and it stays on the ground. Again, I'm not being too precise with scale on this one. This is more like a cartoon art scene. So I'm not super worried, and it's already a miniature. So I'm not overly concerned with making the scale really exact. So I'm going to use a cylinder because I want to get that sort of half arch shape that a lot of mailboxes have. And since we don't yet know how to add edges or vertices to an object, we're going to start with one that already has enough geometry for us to work with. X90, RX90 to flip it this way. Scale it. Place it about where you need it. Scale it on the Y to make it about the right length. So now what I'm going to do is I want to flatten this bottom. So without deleting or adding anything, I can do that by, again, just coming into edit mode, clicking on this object, coming into edit mode. We're going to go in 1 to view the front, and we're going to go into wireframe, and we're going to deselect, and we want to select kind of everything starting from here down. So we're going to drag out a box selection. And using that same scaling principle we talked about earlier, we now have all these vertices selected. We can hit S, Z, and 0. And since our proportional editing is still on, we can just scroll the mouse wheel up and down before we click anything until we get the shape that we want. So that's much more of like a mailbox shape. You can shade these faces selectively flat, tabbing into edit mode, going into face select, selecting all these. I'm using the shortest path method here by clicking and then holding control, clicking, holding control, clicking. So now I have just the curved part selected. Go into face, shade smooth. Shift right clicking to move the cursor once again. Adding a new cube. So when I hit G just now in edit mode, I saw the black circle and I was like, oh no, that's not what I want. So I just right click to drop, cancel that whole operation, turn off proportional editing, G, Z, that's what I want. So now, if I don't tab out of edit mode before I start, I want to add the little flag bit that goes this way. So if I stay in edit mode, click outside it to just drop that selection, Shift A, and add a cube. Now it's going to add a cube at the default size, but it's also going to have the whole thing selected. So you can just from here press S to scale it in. Grab and then Shift X to lock the X value. Scale X. Scale X to make it just as close to even on this one as we can. Maybe move this one out a little bit in the Y. So the cool thing is now because the pivot is down here and this is a single object, you can rotate it like up and down. We can get it even more exact if we snap the pivot to this face. Select the face, Shift S, cursor to selected, back into object mode, right click, origin to 3D cursor. And now when you hit R and X, it will rotate like a little flag. About. I don't know if this is a US thing specifically or not. So if you're not in the US, you have no idea what this is. Don't worry about it. It's just how the mailboxes look. All right, so it's looking pretty good. So already we can see that we've gotten some more levels of detail, not dramatically so, but just by going into edit mode, moving these around, especially for these organic shapes, we're able to get a lot more variation. We're able to pitch our rows, we're able to make more detailed trees, more variation in all of our shapes. So, as I mentioned a few times, I think, in the next video, we're going to learn how to add more points onto any of these shapes so that we can do even more things with it. But this is going to conclude the demo for now, and we'll see you in the next one.